20 years ago, a seed was planted and cared for. We painstakingly nurtured it and weathered it against adversity until one day it blossomed and the fruits of our labor began to show. Today, millions have learned, shared, and been inspired by what our community has produced. We proudly serve 21 million users from 204 countries in 2019. For our 85,000 technical articles, code samples, and videos, our 450,000 forum questions, and our highly anticipated conferences and events featuring keynote panels, live streams, and industry experts and influencers, we recognize and reward members for their dedication to the community. Through content contributions and mentorships, we ranked number 2,620 in the world with a reach of millions across our social media channels. Thanks to you, our global community of software and data developers grows stronger each day. For more information, visit us at csharpcorner.com.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. Depends on where you're joining us. Today is a special episode of Coffee with Pros. My name is Mahesh Chand. I'm founder of C# Corner. Usually, if you join our past Coffee with Pros show, it's usually done by Simon. But this is a different time zone. Today, we are doing I'm here in the Philadelphia area, US, and it's right now 4:30 p.m. So it's really late for Simon in India that they are. And today we have a special guest. Our guest today is Oren Aini. Oren Aini he's a CEO and founder of RavenDB. He's also a Microsoft MVP and community leader, speaker, and so on and so forth. We are going to talk more about RavenDB and MVP program and several other things in today's Coffee with Pros. If you are joining us first time, welcome to the show. If you are joining us back, you are our frequent visitor. Welcome back to the show. As you already may know, if you are joining us back, that this show is for you. We are openly asking questions. If you have any questions about the guest, our guest today, you have a question for him, you have a question about the product, anything you can ask. Besides that, you can also ask any questions about community, MVP program, C# Corner, anything else you have in your list. So we keep it open. Format is pretty open, so feel free to start asking questions. You can ask questions anytime. Our first part of the show will be talking about talking with the guest about the product and services and other general chit chat, and then second half we are going to open up for more questions. And you never know, surprise, one or two people can also join us behind the scene. We're always open to new ideas. So let's get started. So today's our guest is Oren Aini. So let's bring Oren to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hey Oren, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you.
Where are you joining us today? And you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your family, where you live, and work-wise, what you do?
So I'm from Israel. I'm currently about 2 kilometers from the center. Not 2 kilometers. About 1 hour north of the center of Israel. I've been developing since teenage years. I remember doing the turtle in. I'm talking the logo turtle in grade school. So that would be 10, 11, maybe less. And I've been passionate about that and enjoying that for a very long time. I've been running a database company, built our own database, and managed that for the past, more than a decade now, close to 13 years. Mostly dealing with distributed system, high-end performance, and those sort of things. I wrote a couple of books, have a very active blog, talk about software architecture, performance, all sorts of interesting stuff. This is interesting to me.
That's great. And I definitely saw your bio and profile, and you are an MVP. You are several times MVP. I myself was 14 times MVP until this year. I decided to retire from the program. It just takes a lot of work from you. So
Yeah.
yeah, tell me about a little bit about your community work and how did you become MVP and you enjoy it? What do you think? What's your
Uh, Almost by accident. I actually think that I stopped being an MVP with the Corona and everything. The level of community involvement was drastically reduced. But it's an interesting aspect. I wrote a blog, and I wrote a blog mostly for myself, and
yeah?
I've been blogging since 2015.
Okay.
Sorry, no, sorry, not 2015. I've been blogging since 2004.
Oh wow,
Now,
yeah.
yeah. So, just to give some context, you know how you can open a new Twitter account and it has 0 followers.
Yes.
Now, go back 15 years ago, and now, dear God, it's more than 50 years ago now. But go back that far back, and you open your
17
blog.
years.
Yeah, and and it's pretty much the same thing. You open a blog, and no one reads you because no one knows that you exist. But I found that in 2003, 2004, the blogging was everywhere. Everyone blogged, or this, so it seemed, and the level of insight and knowledge that you can gain from those things was amazing. Now, the blog format also gives you a much richer feel to express yourself because you're not limited to a short post or 140 characters or something like that. So I started writing, and I realized that the fact that I'm writing it out and having to express my thoughts in a way that at least supposedly made sense to someone else was an amazing thing for me. And I started writing in response to other people's blog posts and linked to that, and started getting some readership and some people that were interested in what I was doing. I At the time I was serving in the army, and I wasn't in a technical role, so I was effectively starved for a technical experience and expertise, and I used blogging and open source to go over code, read, learn those two things. And I started working on open source projects for fun, for the challenge. And it's surprising how much impact that had been on my life. I mean, try to imagine that, oh, I'm working on this open source project that does a mocking, and I don't like the API that it has, so I'm going to write a new one. And that was Rhinomox, and at some point for 5 years or so, that was the most popular mocking library for the .NET framework. And it turns out that if you want to do mocking, you have to do things such as dynamic code generation. And that meant that I had to learn how to do dynamic code generation. As it turns out, there are dynamic code generation. I'm talking about, let's generate a code at runtime. That can be assembly code, IL, many sort of things like that. And suddenly I'm finding myself before university, before I have actually any real commercial expertise, dealing with deep computer science, theoretical computer science details. And people found the project that I wrote to be useful. So people started talking to me, asking me questions, getting me involved with their community. And at some point, I was accidentally invited to a conference and really got plugged in into the whole conference scene and talking conferences, being much more in your face member of the overall development community. That was a really amazing experience because I got to talk to some really smart people about the topics that I was so passionate about, and suddenly I had this really high level of engagement and interest, and I got to have like tremendous amount of fun, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should mention that during that time frame I was single and with no kids, and it is amazing the amount of hours that you have as a single guy with no kids. I mean, right now, if I want to be up at 2 a.m., I would because the baby is crying.
Yes.
But then it was, oh, I really have to squeeze that this tiny additional bit of performance from the system. And well, I still do this today, but I'm grumpy the next day.
Well, that's great. That's great. So you do not have a formal degree or anything in computer science.
No, I tried doing that. I'm
Yeah.
actually, and it was boring because I had to go through, and I did them at some point. I would have to
Yeah.
go through 3 or 4 years before I would go through any material that I wasn't already familiar with. So
Yeah.
I wrote compilers and databases and distributed databases and all of the sort of things. And uh, in a university, oh, that's master degree. So after you have, I'm not absolutely certain about the English terms, but you typically have the bachelor degrees, which is the first one, and then you have the second one, which is something. But basically, I would have to spend like multiple years until I could do something that is in any way interesting. Which is
Yeah.
actually funny because right now I'm teaching at university, and
Yes.
yeah,
That's funny. Yeah, and
yeah,
yeah, so that's yeah, yeah. I mean, that's great. That I see a lot of people who are just passionate and they get learning into coding and they like it and they just build a career out of it. That's a great story.
yeah. But
Um,
one thing I wanted to address that about education in general because that's something that I found extremely painful in the past. I don't know, 3 years. We try to hire people, and one of the and again I run a database company. I care a lot about the fundamentals of computer science, and my typical go-to question for people that we hire, and for the most part we hire people with zero experience. I found that it is better to get people with no experience and build them up rather than having to deal with all of your instincts are about being an application developer, not a database developer, and those sort of things. But so we are hiring people with no experience. One of the things that we found out is that so many people have almost no concept of the fundamentals of computer science. Now, there are various degrees of what this means in my eyes. So, for example, I have an interview question which effectively means that you have to write a parser to SQL, to a SQL dialect.
yeah,
And for me, if you can do that, there is a 90% chance I'm going to hire you. Now, this isn't something, again, this is anyone who did formal methods or computer which should be able to do that with little issue. But for me, this is okay. This is a high level proof that you know what you're doing. But my go-to question to filter people is explain to me how you would build a phone book in memory. So you have an in-memory application that stores data in memory. It needs to store a phone book and name, and you should ensure that I'm able to search people based on their alphabetical sorting order, and there should never be duplicate phone numbers in the system. Now, if you pay attention, what I'm actually testing here is whatever you can reason that, okay, I need a hash table and a tree, some sort of sorted data structure to operate on. And the number of people who do not get that, they keep trying to give me solutions that are operating in n square time, in other space, or time, or both, is horrendous. Even to the point where I'm asking people, I recently had an interview with someone, and he's a nice person, seems to be hitting on the mark, but he couldn't explain how a hash table works. And not even to the point where, okay, talk about open addressing versus probing or all of the deep details that are involved there. But what are the meaning of using a hash table versus a linked list or those sorts of things? And sorry, this is a pet peeve, and I might be going on a rant here, but I remember doing these sort of exercises as a high school student.
Yeah.
And now I'm talking to people who have literally spent their entire degree on what is supposed to be, you need to be able to write a advanced distributed system and be able to run cloud infrastructure and scale. Show me how you do hash table. Show me that you understand why operating on a sorted data structure is something so crucial.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. I agree with you. Like, I think it's problem solving is important, and a lot of this concept and theoretical knowledge doesn't work in real world. So that's great. So looks like anybody who's watching us today, we are here live with the Oren Eleni. Oren is from Israel, correct? I got it right.
So again,
Yeah. And then you're founder and CEO of Raven DB. We are going to talk about Raven DB a little bit. Right now, we're just talking in general. So if you are trying to get hired by Oren, he just gave you the one clue.
Yeah.
You can go watch this.
Read about data structures. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, it is one of the things that I did was I would post answers to my interview questions online.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that I every now and then I would reuse the interview questions, and people would come prepared. And it's funny because you see the difference in depth of the people, even the people who did the research and took the literally the official answer, because I wrote the question and the answer, and it was easy to see how much they actually knew and were able to work with. And I don't. I'm sorry. The hiring people is really frustrating because of those sort of things. Because I don't think that we have any sort of really deep, unfathomable scenarios. But currently, you finish a degree and you don't know how to do those sort of things, and that's expected.
Yeah, that's a problem. That's a problem, especially if you're going to work with a database company, right? If it's a web project and all you're doing is building the UI, that's a different story. You may never, but you may never need data structure.
I would strongly disagree.
Yeah.
Uh,
No.
I,
Yeah.
no, I will tell you why. Because you may not need to the same level, but think about the number of times that people are doing a linear search inside the client, and nowadays a client in the browser or something like that is able and typically expected to handle a megabyte or to hundreds of or to tens of megabytes at least range of data. And if you think about most non-trivial applications, they're dealing with significant amount of work. And when you there is this tendency to say, oh, this is just front end or something like that. And my feeling is that the level of expertise that you need in order to build high quality front end system is super high, because leaving aside things like, oh, you need to know things about how do you properly reduce the number of routers to the server and compress everything and all sort of stuff like that. Or I need to do things like scan through all of the items that the user selected to make some determination. Or you know what, even something as heat testing in the if I'm showing some complex user interface. All of those are things that you need to be that there's a lot of chance for abuse, and you can see that also when in the front end board. Oh, I have a multi-megabyte client-side application, and and you compare that to application from 5 years ago, not 50.
Yeah.
And the why is it so big, and what are you doing with all of that JavaScript inside my poor machine?
Yeah.
You remember when you purchased a machine? I remember my first modern machine. That was a Pentium 133 megahertz with 16 megabyte of RAM and 1.6 gigabyte of disk space, running Windows 95. And the reason I remember those specs so clearly was that my parents, I was not even in high school then, bought me this computer, and my uncle was had a computer store, and he gave us a really good discount, but it was still, comparable to buying a car almost.
Yeah.
And I remember that in the time it took to order the computer and the time it took for it to arrive, and we're talking about 2 weeks maybe, it was no longer a new machine. There was a new CPU generation, the Pentium MMX, that made this machine feel obsolete. And I remember operating in those sort of environment, remembering, I can rely on, I have a year to develop this software, so I can assume that the hardware that I'm going to run on this would be twice as strong. And rely on that when I'm making a determination for what sort of hardware am I going to need and how I should design my system. And today, I have a 7-year-old laptop still usable, and previously 7 years was, you can't even give that away. You have to pay for someone to recycle that.
Yep. Yeah. No, that's great. I agree. I think things are changing so fast, and now client side is becoming a main. It's like the major work is done client side. Browsers can handle ton of memories now, and processing as well. So everybody watching us today, we're talking to Oren. We're going to talk about now. Let's switch our gears to Raven DB, and you're founder and CEO of Raven DB. You want to tell us a little bit, how did you come up with the idea of the product, and what made you to start create your own database?
Yeah, so I said before that I started working on open source projects. One of those open source projects is called Hibernate. Now, this is a project that it's an object relational mapper, which is meant to make it easy for you to operate over a data store in a relational database. The idea here is that Hibernate is a library that would translate your tables to in-memory entities and handle all of those details for you. So I got sucked into that, honestly, by accident. And as a result of that, what happened was that I started working a lot with databases, doing lots of projects around data. And at some point, my main source of living was going from one customer to the next and helping them optimize their Hibernate-based application. Now, this is important because I end up messing up and I sent the report from one client to another client. And that sucks, but nothing that major was there that was super secret. But the thing that killed me was that the client I sent the wrong report to says, "Oh, thank you very much for your insight. This is going to be very helpful. We're going to refactor the application, and I will let you know how it goes." And I double checked that 3 times, and I realized that I sent the report from an insurance company to a real estate company. So it's not like there was even in the same field or something like that. Here you have leases and packages and a bunch of other stuff like that. And here you have policies and terms and exclusions. But they face the same set of problems, and they had to and the solution that they offer for both of them was the same. And at that point, I realized that I wasn't actually doing something particularly valuable for my customer. I would go and tell them the same thing they could read in my blog, but I would tell them about. Sorry, it's almost midnight here. I would
Yep,
tell
yep,
them.
I hear you. We need a coffee, and that's what we are even doing coffee with pros. We need coffee. Yeah.
So I would basically come and tell them, here the set of 4 or 5 common mistakes that you're doing. This is how you resolve them. So I decided that what, I'm going to automate myself, and I wrote a tool. It's called an Hardware Profiler, and then I wrote a tool called Entity Framework Profiler that was meant to allow you to effectively automate all of this process of analyzing what the interaction between your database and the application does, so you don't need to really consider how that works. And I did that, and that was amazing. First of all, because that was the first time I actually was able to sell a product. And as a consultant, I was used to, if I'm not out there working at the client, I'm not making any money, and
Yep.
someone needs to pay the mortgage. And once I had a product out, and I realized that what, I was off today, and someone purchased the product, so yay, I made money basically while being at the beach. And that was that was an interesting observation for me, and it was still not enough because I was still very actively involved with people who ran into problems with their databases, and they kept falling into the same pitfalls, and that was incredibly annoying. And I started thinking about what I could do to make it better, and I realized that I was dealing with smart people who were doing their best to deliver high quality stuff, but they kept falling into this quicksand and having trouble to get out. So I started to think, what would be the perfect database? The database that would allow you to do all of the usual things that you need to do, but without having to deal with all of the complexities, all of the traps, etc. And that was daydream, basically. But it wouldn't leave my head. This was actually quite annoying. I was trying to build, I'm trying to do some billable hours, or I'm trying to work on the new features for my product or something like that, and I get stuck doing this fantasy database that I would love to if someone would invent. And because no one invented that, I was basically stuck. At some point, I sat down and wrote the design document. This is how I would build this sort of database. And that helped because now I got it out of my head and into paper, or actually into my blog. But then I started getting this itch. I really want that to be something real. So I said, okay, let me spend, a weekend or two just to get just to get it out, just to make sure that I can concentrate. And several months later, I realized that I was working myself to exhaustion because I was spending 18 hours a day working on the database, and then spending another 8 hours a day working on customer stuff. And if you did the math, that's not enough hours of the day.
Yeah, that's a
So
lot of time. Yeah.
so I decided that I couldn't actually continue doing that. But the problem with that is that it was still in my head. I couldn't get it out. So I said, okay, let's get it out. Let's see what it would take to actually make it into a product that I can actually sell and make a living off. And my assumption was that this would fail. So I actually set out intentionally preparing for failure. So if I would fail, I would lose time, opportunities, but wouldn't lose my shirt, basically. I would still be more or less okay. And it turns out that this is actually quite successful. We're now, we hired this week the 42 people right now that is working full time on RavenDB. And we've been in production since 2010.
Wow, that's a pretty big team. That's awesome.
Yeah, yeah. And it's an interesting, when I'm thinking about the story, it looks very linear from a backward history, but it was a lot of uncertainty and do we do this, do we do that, but along the way. But what ended up happening was that we created a database. It's called RavenDB. It's a NoSQL, or rather more exactly, it's a non-relational document database. It is a distributed database, so you can store the data using JSON. You can store the data across multiple nodes at the same time using a multi-primary situation. And it ends up that there is actually quite a lot of interest in those sort of situations because it enables you to do all sorts of really interesting features. For example, you may want to have a database that resides in every store that you have and is able to operate independently, but also in conjunction with every other store that exists. So, for example, I need to manage my stock, but my stock is managed on a per store basis. So I want to store that locally and be able to operate on that locally, even if there is network disruption. But at the same time, I want to have a global view as long as I'm able to actually access the data. So you can set up RavenDB and this sort of a cluster and share data across the entire system.
No, that's great. So I want to talk more about exactly on these topics. Is if a lot of people who are watching this show and even our audience, I would say majority of them are relational database developers. They use SQL Server, they use Oracle. I would say for our audience, SQL Server is probably the most used database.
Mm-hmm.
And
So-
I know, yeah, even my background, right? I know that's basically our go-to automatic. There's a new application, okay, you need database, okay, let's do a SQL Server because that's what we know. So my question to you, everybody who's watching, is that I think first is that main difference between, it doesn't have to be long, quick. I think I have a feeling we have to do another show on detail of technical details,
Yeah.
even how to use the RavenDB in our .NET and all that. But in brief, if you can explain the difference between relational and NoSQL, and when should they be choosing one over other RavenDB?
So let's ask let me ask you a question. What was the last big project that you did in terms of the field, insurance, retail, those sort of things? Can you tell me?
Yeah, I did recent. We are working on a project right now, and it's they're pretty large applications we're doing right now.
Okay. What is the field, the business area in which you're working?
I mean, it's a SQL Server database.
No, no. I'm
Yeah.
talking about. Are you doing an online shop? Are you doing a online gambling, a tax preparation software, those sort of things? I'm trying to think
This
about.
is more like, yeah, this is a think of this as it's a gamification game system. It has apps. It also has a
Mhm,
website for admin portions where admin is
mhm.
customers, right? And then users can go on the apps as well as website. So
Okay.
it's for average. It's not for a business. It's more for like a consumers, average anybody out there.
Okay.
Just, yeah.
So let's assume that we're talking about a game, and let's talk about the. Let's say we're talking about something like a typical game today. You have users; they may compete
Yeah.
against one another. And now let's talk about what sort of data model we have. We have the concept of a user. We have the concept of the level, games that you play, uh, the entire interaction, all of those sort of things that you have to work with. Now, if you consider the totality of the domain model that you have, you tend to realize that the more complex your system is, the more rich behavior it has, the more trouble you have at the database side.
Yes.
Let's assume that you have a character in a game. So you have inventory, you have stats, you have status effects, you have a debuffs and buffs and all bunch of
Skills.
other stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, forgot about skills, class
Yeah.
levels, all bunch of other stuff like that. Now, how do you represent that in a relational database? And the answer is that you represent that with many, many tables. Now
Yeah.
let's talk about the something that is supposedly very simple. I want you to show me the character screen, which means that you have to pull pretty much all of the information about the character right now,
Yes.
which sits on 52 tables.
Yes.
And the reason that I give you the 52 table is because recently I had to write a blog post about this sort of domain model, and I went and looked into the sort of domain models that you have for D&D games. So a great example is that consider you have a character and you have slots. You have chest slot, head slot, ring, stuff like that. Each one of them may have, and for different characters, you may have different slot configuration. And each slot, you may have one or more items. So now, just to figure out what equipment you have, before we got to what status effect each equipment has, you have to go for the character table to the slots table to the equipped slots table to the equipment to the status effects. Now we are at 6 tables.
Yeah.
Now consider what happened when you render the page. How much work do you expect the backend to do? And I think this is beyond anything else one of the primary factors that you have to take into account in terms of the difference between SQL Server and RavenDB. RavenDB allows you to store the entire character as a single item because
Yeah. The whole
RavenDB,
whole entity.
the whole entity. Now,
Yeah.
think about how it works from the point of view of your system. In the typical way that you have a front end that communicate over HTTP to a backend, and they transfer back and forth data as JSON.
Yeah.
Now, the key here is that you have JSON in the front end, JSON speaking backend, but then you have a relational database. So a
Yeah.
lot of the time and effort goes into just uh, uh, deconstructing and constructing the JSON to tables and from tables.
Yeah.
With RavenDB, you can store the data as a JSON document directly. And that actually allows you to operate on the data in a much more coherent manner. Because instead of splitting it up into multiple locations, just operate it as is. It also means that you're able to do all of the usual database things that you want to do. You can run queries, you can mutate documents and have an atomic transaction, those sort of things. And that's actually quite fascinating to look at and observe, because it means that, wow, I don't have to deal with all of that complexity. I can just get the data, store it, and move on. Now, it gets interesting when you have more complex system. What happens if you have a relationship between documents? You want to operate over multiple documents at once, stuff like that. But let's take something that is probably a really good representative example of the sort of difference between a RavenDB and a SQL Server. RavenDB is not meant to be a general purpose database.
Yeah.
It's meant to be an application database, so it's meant to be used by a single application or multiple components part of the same application or system. And it is specifically for OLTP, online transaction processing, for managing business applications. Why do I mention that? Because this is what I was doing. I was building business application, helping customers building this, and I built the features to help that. Now, let's talk about what is probably the simplest, stupidest thing that you need to do first in an application. You want to show a grid of items, of details.
Yeah.
So let's think about how do I do something like that in SQL Server. I do a select star from blah, join blah, 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 where blah, 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 and limit 15 or top 15, whatever the syntax is. Now you get the first 15 results. Easy, simple, great. There is a problem here. And the problem here is that you also need to ask another question. I need to show the number of items so I can show you how many items you have in a page.
Yep.
And that means that you now have to take the previous query, execute it again with a select count.
Yep.
Now, let's see how it typically works in most systems. Mahesh, tell me how many, tell me the first 3 pictures behind your back. So you turn, you say, here is A, B, and C. Great. Now you give it to me, and now it says, okay, tell me how many pixels you have behind your back. And you turn, and you tell me, and that's great. But I had to make 2 separate queries, 2 network round trips, and I have to execute the query twice in order to answer this question. With Raven, what happens is that you send the query and says, hey, give me the first 3 pictures behind your back, and what you will tell me is here are the first 3, and by the way, I have 8 pictures behind my back, something like that. And you have 9 pictures behind your back, by the way. So it really bugged me.
I didn't even count.
Yeah, sorry. And it sounds like a really, really stupid feature, but it ends up because you spend a lot of time working on this, and it has 0 meaningful reason for you to spend time on it. It's just, here is the numbers, just plug them into the grid component and move on. These are no one ever said that, oh, my paging system is my competitive advantage.
Yeah.
But again, now you start seeing something like that, and just you move on. Here's another example. In most modern systems, you have complex relationships between locations, so between entities. So you typically need to query all sorts of stuff. How do you do that in a relational database? You either do that as separate queries, in which case you're paying a lot just in the cost of network traffic, or you're doing that using joins. But joins have quite a few problems. They allow you to create Cartesian products, which can explode the amount of data that you get back. They force you to do much more work at the database engine level. And in general, many people just don't get them. especially the performance implications of them. Raven says something different. You have a document. The document is its own thing. What you can do, you can say, hey, I want you, when I'm getting the order, I want you to also load me this related document that is stored in the company field. And the idea here is that include in this manner is not a join. It doesn't mutate the shape of the data. It's just additional data that I'm pushing to you. And if you're familiar with front-end technology, think about HTTP2 and the ability to do push-based values. So by the time you end up asking for the value, it is already there. And what is the impact that you have on the performance of the system?
Yep.
Now, there are dozens of features like that has a huge impact in the end. Some of them are minor, like the count. Some of them have profound impact on the design of your system. RavenDB allows you to do something called lazy queries. And a lazy query is basically a promise to get the result of the query. You can think about, in the .NET terms, it is very much like a task, but the whole idea is this is task that doesn't get executed. And why is that? Because instead of executing the task, what RavenDB is going to do, it's going to wait until you actually await and force me to actually execute this. Why does it matter? It matters because it allows you to issue multiple queries. So give me all of the people with the red shirts. Give me all of the trees with the tasty fruits, whatever. Now, I haven't actually sent anything to the database. I just issued, I just told everybody, I want to have that information. And he says, okay, I will wait until you gather, okay, what is the answer? And then it's going to gather all of the questions that you have and send them to the database in one shot. Now, one of the things that is really important, there is something called fallacies of distributed computing. And nowadays, pretty much any application that we write is a distributed system. So we have to understand those fallacies. And the first fallacy is that the network is reliable, the bandwidth is infinite, and latency is zero. Now, I love to give the example of going to the store. If I tell you, go to the store, get me milk, and you come back and says, and I tell you, okay, great. Now go to the store and get me coffee, and go to the store, get me a cup so I can drink the coffee in the cup. So I sent you to the store 3 times. The time that you spent going back and forth to the store, the latency that you have, is so much more than the time you spend in the actual store. But most systems or most databases would force you to do that one at a time. Versus with RavenDB, you can hand the database a shopping list and only go there once.
That's a great example. I love that. I think I'm going to use that some of my future discussions. As I like that. This is an easier way to explain. Trips to the database backend, trip to the backend. Yeah, that's great. So no, I think looks like we definitely have to do more shows on this because we want to get into more details in depth and but now let's talk about, so that's kind of, I'm sure even on your website, if somebody goes, they can see what are the benefits of RavenDB, right? You have probably comparing with other databases and so on and so forth. So Simon is already putting the website link here. So anybody's interested in watching us now or after recorded sessions, check out the website ravendb.net. So Oren, I want to talk more about the pricing, right? So I'll give you an example why pricing is very important to me. Is recently, we have C# Corner is a big website.
Yeah.
We have millions of members, and these members do certain things every day. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And we have hundreds of thousands of documents, means the articles, the blogs, and I think we have 500,000 forums and so on and so forth. And so many. So we use SQL Server for our, because it's a legacy system and we never really rebuilt it. It was done in 2001. That's when we started building it. And we really
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. we never really moved from there, right? Because it's a community site. It's not really our high priority, but it works.
Hmm.
And recently we moved. So we were hosting this on hosting company, but recently we moved to Azure. So now we have Azure SQL there. We are using SQL Server there. The licensing is a cost, a lot of big cost. So how does your Raven DB fits in licenses? What the pricing works? So if I'm a software developer or architect, I'm looking for at least pricing perspective. I want to propose to my management. You want to tell us a little bit about pricing, how the model works? Yeah.
So before that, I want to ask a question. One of the things that happens in sites like C# Corner, you have all of this data, but you also need to do operations such as full text search. Are you
Yeah.
doing that through SQL Server or using something external like Elastic or Solar or something
No,
like
we use SQL Server for that.
that? Okay. Uh,
We're also combining with Google searches as well. So
okay.
because Google searches sometimes gives better queries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The reason I'm asking is that full text search inside SQL Server has interesting aspects. It's quite hard to tune this properly, and as you said, Google would tend to do a better job in this regard. And the reason I'm saying that RavenDB would be in the situation like that, the system of record, as well as allow you to do full text search, all sorts of really interesting indexes on that. Now, in terms of licensing, RavenDB have two options that you can run it. You can run it in what we call on-premise, where you supply the hardware and you just purchase a license, or you can run RavenDB as in a database as a service, in which case you just basically pay for the capacity that you reserve. In both options, we have a free option available. By the way, it also means that we have a free cloud options that you can use. Doesn't require a credit card, doesn't require anything else. And we have a community edition available that is again the only thing that you have to do is just register for the license key. I haven't actually mentioned that, but RavenDB is actually a open source project. It's written in almost completely in C#.
Oh, nice. I'm interested. That's great.
Here's a recommendation: if you're not running on .NET Core, or it's called now .NET Just, but run there. Run to the .NET Core, to the .NET 6.0 and whatever. So much better in so many respects, and the kind of things that you can do is just flat out amazing. But so RavenDB is an open source project. You can go and look at the code. I think at least it's quite interesting. But beyond the free tiers in the cloud or the community edition, if you run on your hardware, we price the software on a per core basis. Okay. So if you go to, and this is actually something quite interesting, because if you go to a website and you could go to RavenDB.net/buy, you will find pricing details. So you're going to say, I'm going to run it on a 4-core machine, and you're going to say, okay, the cost per core is I think $789, so $789 times 4 cores. That would be about $3,100 for what I need. And the reason I'm mentioning that and I'm giving you those specific numbers is that in many cases, when you look at the product, it says, okay, what is the licensing? You go and they have contact us, and which is a key phrase for this is going to be expensive.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that I really care about in general is the notion that my purpose is to be boring. I mean, I find database infrastructure to be fascinating, but from the point of view of someone who is using the database, they want to know nothing about that. You just need to sit in the corner, answer the questions, and don't say anything unless I ask you. And that has a lot of impact on the design of the software, but from our perspective, it also has a lot of design, or all of the aspects on the design of the product. So I don't want you to have to go through multi-step evaluation process before we can give you a quote that where we judge what is the maximum amount of money that we can extract.
Yeah.
I want you to be able to say, hey, I think that this would be a viable thing. How much is it going to cost? Go to the website. Oh, here are the numbers. I'm plugging that, and the only thing that I have to do is multiplication with how many resources I got, and that's it.
No, that's great. That's great. And I think I'm actually following in. The other thing is I run a company, Mindcracker, here in the US, and it's a consulting company. I started that in 2003. So we have a lot of clients. Most of
Mhm.
them are enterprises, and they use either Oracle or SQL Server or Azure SQL.
Mhm.
So I want to propose this to some of the clients. Say, hey, I think Raven DB is probably a better choice. So I think that's when I need to learn more. And pricing comes really one of the biggest
Yeah.
challenges, right? Understanding that. And enterprise already have their deals with, say, Microsoft. They're already saying, oh, we already have licenses, just use that.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
I should be able to go and say, you know what, maybe this is a better choice.
Yeah.
You know what
It's
would be
actually.
cool feature is, oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. Go ahead, please.
I just want to give you an idea that would be really, really cool feature for your
Mhm.
database, and I wish all databases have that, is that when you have your own DBA, that's great, but sometimes just developers are building that, right? So developers build, they don't even know what's going on the database side.
Mhm.
They just build, put their table, data goes in, software runs. And
Mhm.
you buy 4Cal and whatever.
Mhm.
Imagine you become this Raven DB, the intelligent database, not the smart database, I'm talking about intelligent. And it'll say, oh, you bought the 4Cal, but guess what? Based on your last 6 months or a year data consumption and all that, I think you should reduce this to 2Cal. Or, oh, we will run. That would be cool for me if you
Mhm.
start telling you that, oh, by the way, this table you have this and its data is sitting there for a year and you have never really accessed it. Maybe you want to archive.
Yeah. So that's interesting. One of the things that early in the lifetime of RavenDB, it was extremely opinionated. There are all sorts of things that you can do to a database that would cause problems. For example,
Yeah,
let's assume that I have a table or collection that has 100 million items, and I'm doing select star from table.
yeah,
That's going to kill the server, that's going to kill the client, especially if you're trying to read all of that into memory. So initially, Raven would say, no, you have, by default, if you didn't specify a limit to the query, we would give you our own limit. And that was great in terms of making sure that the system was survivable, because even if you didn't do if you didn't specify a limit and you had a big collection, then you would get the first page and not 100,000 items. But it turns out that users hated that, because from their perspective, let's say that the default page size was 1,000. So the moment that the data went from 1,000 to 1,001, the query, unless they specify what the supposed query size was, they would they said, oh, I'm losing data because I'm only getting the 4,000 results and not all of them. So we stopped doing that, but I still very much believe that you cannot just throw a developer out there. Again, the whole idea is that I'm assuming that the persons who are using it, the people who are using me, are not trying to be expert in databases, just trying to get things done. So RavenB actually has a quite sophisticated internal monitoring system that will tell you about, hey, I can see that you query 5,000 items in this query, but you didn't specify a where clause. That's not performant. Or you're doing this sort of query, but here is this much better way of doing that. You know what? Here's something. Here's a feature that only RavenB has.
yeah,
You had, and I'm 100% sure that you had this case. You had this query that was supremely expensive, and then at some point someone went in and added an index, and it became nothing.
yep.
And
All the
and
time, all the
yeah,
time.
yeah. And the problem here is that you never see that in development, because you're
Yeah,
working on much smaller data sets, and it's very easy to sneak in this query that can take down the database because it's so expensive doing table scan and whatnot. RavenME doesn't support table scan queries. it only supports running a query over an index. And
Yeah.
that ends up being actually quite interesting. And why is that? Because how do I do a query? One of the options is to force the user to define an index each time. We started doing that. That was awkward. So then we moved to a different model. You issue a query, and RavenDB is going to analyze the query and decide what is the optimal index to use that. And this is fairly standard stuff. But the next step is what happens if I don't have the appropriate index? And if I don't have the appropriate index, what I'm going to do, RavenDB automatically is going to go ahead and generate the appropriate index for you.
That's
Now,
awesome.
this is actually much more sophisticated because we're not just doing that based on a single operation. We're doing that over the set of operations we've done on the system over time. So as you make more queries, you give Remedy more information about your operational environment. Now try to imagine that you deploy version 2.0 of your software. You change the behavior of your system, maybe slightly, maybe significantly. Now, at that point, if you're running on a relational database, you have to rerun your entire system under observation to figure out what changes you have to do. With RavenDB, Raven says, I see that things are different. Let me adjust. And that just happened like that.
I like that. I like that because I'm telling you, we need to discuss this more, and I think we need to definitely set up some private calls as well. We're gonna experiment some on the C sharp one. The problem is we have so much data for so many years, and I'm telling you, some of the data is like, why even we have this? Why are we even querying the database with millions of records? Where I know
Yeah,
that 10 years ago, these people are not in developers, they're like past, they're not even
yeah,
active in the database. So,
yeah.
yeah,
But again, millions of records is the uh, this is Tuesday, millions of records. That's what it is, and the reason I'm saying that a database that is we recently had we ran a benchmark, and we ran a benchmark over 1.3 billion records,
yeah.
and trying to run that on 15,000 queries per second. And
Mm.
note, with 15,000 queries per second on not super big hardware, I can give you results in under 220 seconds for 99.99 of the cases.
Wow, that's
And
nice.
yeah, and all sorts of other stuff like that. Just, you don't need to think about it.
Yeah. No, that's great. Well, I think we kind of ran out of the time here. This was very quite interesting
Mm.
because it's also personally, I'm more interested in it. I never have used RavenDB. I'm going to start looking into that more for our other projects because we do know SQL databases for some projects.
Mhm.
We do, a perfect example is some objects we are storing. So that's something I would look into that. But to me, I think we need to schedule more of these, not coffee with pros, but more like a technical, even demos.
Mhm.
We also do frequent conference and events. Maybe we'll love you to get you like presentations and
I
all.
would love that. Yeah.
Uh, yeah. Simon, anything else? Looks like we won't have any time for questions. But I really appreciate Oren you coming in the late night. We are also better if it's earlier in the day is better for you. That's also good for us, for me especially, because we do these shows actually at 10 a.m. Eastern. So most our users are used to a 10 a.m., 11 a.m., 12 a.m. Eastern time, which is about 5, 6, 6, 7 of your trade, 5,
Yeah,
6.
I just checked. That's 5:30 p.m. for me. This is great.
Yeah. So yeah, that's perfect, and that's really when we do more when things are starting. Simon, anything else you want to add? But this was fantastic. I think I'm more interested in that because I want to put all those intelligence behind those database where developers don't have to really look again and oh, should we look at this? Our queries, all those data, old data, not being used, useless data. You know, um, so I guess that's all. We don't, Simon, you good from your side? If you're not saying anything, I think we're good. Oren, again, thank you so much for joining us on C Sharp
Thank you for
Corner.
having me.
On behalf of all our members who are watching, everybody who watched us today, thank you so much. I appreciate you being with us here on a on this evening. I'm sure in India it's even more night. In Europe is kind of quite evening there, late evening. So everybody enjoy your week, and I'll talk to you again soon.
Okay, thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye.